Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today with a realization that honestly makes me a little uncomfortable.
Okay, wait on me.
Well, you know that constant drumbeat in the news right now?
Yeah.
The one about how governments are racing to catch up to AI. It's always this dramatic image of legislators sprinting to write laws while the tech just zooms past them.
Right. Yeah, it's the defining narrative of the decade, really. The tortoise and the hare. Except the hare is powered by a fusion reactor and the tortoise is filling out paperwork in triplicate.
Exactly. But here is the hook for today's deep dive. What if that race is already over? Like, what if the tortoise didn't just lose, but is actually running on a completely different track? And this is the part that kind of twists your brain. What if the goal shouldn't be to rein in the technology at all, but to completely redesign the house it lives in?
That is exactly the shift we need to make, and it brings us right to the source material we're covering today. We are back with the Designing Future series authored by Jafar. This is episode 5, Don't Regulate AI, Architect It.
I am so glad we're back on this series. It always manages to just cut through the noise.
It really does. But before we get into the mechanics, we have to set the frame that Jafar establishes for this entire project. It's crucial for you listening to remember this. Designing Futures is not a solutions manual. It is a narrowing of the field. This series explores which futures remain structurally viable once trade-offs, incentives, and limits are taken seriously.
That is such a vital distinction. We aren't talking about utopias or what should happen in a perfect world. We're talking about what can happen given the physics of the situation.
Right.
And today, that reality centers on something the author calls the downstream state.
Correct. And to be clear right up front, this is not a political discussion. We aren't taking sides between the left or the right. We aren't framing tech firms as villains or states as victims. This is entirely about structural leverage. It's about plumbing, not ideology.
All right, so let's unpack this downstream state concept. The core thesis here seems to be a paradox. As governments and economies become increasingly dependent on AI for everything from tax revenue to basic infrastructure, their actual direct control over how that AI evolves is shrinking.
It is the paradox of dependency. Think about it. The more you rely on a system to survive, the less leverage you have to boss it around. The mission of this deep dive is to explore how a state can move from a position of reactive regulation to something the source calls ecosystem orchestration.
Okay, let's look at the board as it stands today. It feels like we are way past the point of deciding whether or not we use AI.
Oh, that ship has sailed. It's circumnavigated the globe and is already building a colony. AI has won the adoption battle. It isn't just a peripheral tool anymore. It is the growth engine of modern economies. It's the backbone of public infrastructure. If you unplug it, the lights go out, economically speaking.
So if it's the backbone, why is the state losing control? I mean, usually if you own the roads, you make the traffic laws.
But the state doesn't own the roads here. This is where the metaphor of upstream and downstream is so essential. Imagine a river. Upstream is where the water originates. In the AI context, the upstream is a highly concentrated cluster of firms and jurisdictions that hold the massive compute power, the frontier models, and the elite talent.
And everyone else is downstream.
Everyone. Most sovereign states, the Fortune 500, and certainly you and I, we are downstream. We operate as consumers. To use the exact phrasing from the source, we are renters of cognitive infrastructure.
Renters of cognitive infrastructure. That sounds really precarious. It implies you can be evicted.
Or the rent goes up, or the landlord changes the locks. And this creates a severe structural bind. You might ask, well, why not just slow down? Why don't states just hit the brakes?
Right.
Well, if states slows down adoption, they lose competitive parity. Their economy drags, their tax base shrinks relative to countries that did adopt it. But here is the trap. If they accelerate adoption to keep up, they just deepen their dependency on external infrastructure they don't control.
It's a total catch-22. You're irrelevant if you don't adopt, and you're dependent if you do.
Exactly. And the more you depend on it, the less direct leverage you have. It's not because the government is weak or incompetent. It is purely a matter of structural positioning. You simply cannot dictate terms to the supplier of your oxygen.
That is a haunting image. But it really helps explain why traditional regulation feels so ineffective right now, which leads us into the speed mismatch and policy lag. We have economic dependency, we have infrastructure concentration, and then we have this third force, speed.
This is the friction point that breaks the old model. We have to look at the timelines. AI capabilities evolve in cycles measured in months, sometimes even weeks. But democratic bureaucracy by design moves in cycles measured in years.
Right, because democracy is supposed to be deliberative. It's a feature, not a bug. But in this context, it becomes a liability.
In terms of raw speed, yes. By the time a regulation is debated, drafted, voted on, and implemented,
The technology it was meant to regulate is 3 generations old.
exactly. It's like trying to catch a supersonic jet with a butterfly in it. Policy is almost always late by design. And the speed mismatch is exactly why blunt instruments fail. You see governments reacting from a downstream position trying to impose bans or strict protectionism.
Like banning a specific app or trying to put a moratorium on training models. We see those proposals all the time.
We do. And what actually happens? Capital simply creates a workaround. Businesses exit the market and move to a jurisdiction that is more upstream or more permissible. Or even worse, the usage goes into shadow channels.
Shadow channels meaning what?
Meaning unmonitored usage. People use VPNs, companies route through offshore servers. The activity doesn't stop. It just goes underground where the state has absolutely zero visibility.
So you literally cannot ban the engine of your own economy without severe consequences. If we can't ban it and we can't regulate it fast enough, what is left?
A strategic pivot. And this is the core of Don't Regulate AI, Architect It. We have to completely redefine what we mean by sovereignty.
Okay, redefine it how? Because normally sovereignty means being the boss of your territory.
In a world of upstream concentration, sovereignty can no longer mean control. The days of a state having absolute control over every bit of information crossing its borders are fading. Instead, sovereignty has to mean agency.
Agency. What's the practical distinction there?
Agency is the ability to deliberately shape how AI is integrated and relied upon. It's not about stopping the water from flowing down the river. It's about building the canals, the dams, and the irrigation systems to ensure that water feeds your crops instead of flooding your cities.
That makes a lot of sense. So we're shifting from being an operator, someone trying to drive the bus, to an architect.
An architect, an allocator, and an orchestrator. The source argues we need to stop treating AI as a single object to be governed. We need to treat it as an integrated stack. Data, compute models, applications people. You can't control the frontier models upstream, but you can engineer the environment around them.
Let's get into the how. This is where the design levers of sovereignty come in. If I'm a policymaker listening to this, what are the levers I can actually pull? Because architecting sounds great, but what does it look like in practice?
The source outlines a specific design space with 4 key levers. The first is distributed innovation capacity.
Meaning what exactly?
It means building domestic capability loops rather than relying solely on global vendors. If a state relies entirely on one upstream provider, they have zero leverage. The goal is to build regional labs and empower mid-tier firms that can fine-tune models locally.
So you might not build the foundational model because that costs billions, but you build the ecosystem that applies it.
Precisely. You build the transmission and the tires so you aren't helpless if the engine manufacturer changes the specs. You maintain local capacity to adapt.
Okay, build your own muscles. What is the second lever?
Liquidity and circulation. Ensuring that the productivity gains from AI actually reinforce the domestic economy.
Right, because if everyone just pays a subscription to a massive upstream company, that money leaves the economy. It drains the tax base.
It's capital flight, yes. If a nation's cognitive infrastructure is entirely rented from abroad, the value flows out. Architecting here means creating incentive structures that keep value circulating locally. Tax incentives for local implementation, ensuring efficiency gains, boost local wages rather than just upstream dividends.
You have to catch the rain before it runs off into the ocean.
Exactly. Now, the third lever is really fascinating. Living sandboxes.
That sounds like a contradiction. Laws aren't usually living.
Which is the problem. It contrasts directly with static law. Usually we write a rule vote on it, and it sits there for 20 years. In the age of AI, that is institutional lag at its worst. By the time the ink is dry, the context has changed entirely.
So living sandbox is what? A regulatory environment that updates itself.
Yes, it's an environment that learns and adapts. You allow companies to experiment within certain boundaries, and the regulations evolve based on real-time data. The regulator evolves with the technology. It changes the state from a static gatekeeper to an active gardener.
That requires a completely different kind of institutional agility. Okay, what is the fourth lever?
Architectural sovereignty. This is about using standards, routing rules, and exposure limits to manage how the state interacts with the tech.
Give me a concrete example of that. How do routing rules give a state agency?
Imagine a national healthcare system. A state might say, look, we can't build a model better than the global frontier model, so you can use it. But for patient data, the data cannot leave our borders. It must be routed through a local protocol anonymized locally, and only the query goes out.
Oh, I see. You aren't banning the model, you're just determining the plumbing of how it plugs into your critical infrastructure.
Exactly. You are managing the interface. You control the gateway, not the destination. You decide what data is exposed through code and architecture rather than just a symbolic policy document.
That is incredibly practical. It's a shift from stopping AI to safely handling AI.
It is, and this brings us to a really crucial concept in the text: epistemic leverage.
Epistemic meaning knowledge, right?
Yes. The insight here is that you don't need to own the underlying model to understand how it works or how to use it safely. You can understand a system without owning it.
Like, I don't need to be a mechanic to know how to drive a car on ice.
Exactly. And you need to know if the brakes are working. The source argues heavily for a shared knowledge commons. We need baseline AI literacy across the public, not just teaching people to code, but helping the public understand the actual mechanics and risks of these systems.
Why is public literacy so important for the state's leverage, though?
Because it makes strategic caution politically survivable. If the public doesn't understand AI, they panic. They demand impossible bans because they feel helpless.
So ignorance forces leaders into those blunt, bad decisions we talked about earlier.
Precisely. If the public has baseline literacy, a leader can say, we aren't banning this, but we are architecting it this way for safety, and the public understands the nuance. Knowledge is a form of epistemic leverage that allows for smart, long-term decisions.
That makes perfect sense. But there's a section here that is a bit heavy. The boundary of capability.
Yes, we have to acknowledge the inequality gradient here. Not every country can do this. Implementing architectural sovereignty requires strong physical capacity, high-level technical talent, and resilient institutions.
So what happens to the nations that lack that capacity?
They risk becoming pure consumers. This defines a new gradient of global inequality. It's no longer just rich versus poor, it is architect versus renter. Some nations simply do not have the technical capacity to act, and that is a stark reality.
That really raises the stakes. You can't architect the house. You're just living in someone else's guest room. Which leads us to the final section, the cost of waiting.
The source frames this as a definitive leadership choice. You have two paths. Path one is reacting from a position of dependency. You wait for the tech to arrive and then scramble to fix the problems it causes.
Always one step behind, always cleaning up.
Right. Path two is designing an ecosystem where innovation and stability reinforce each other. You accept the tech, but you actively build the house it lives in.
And the risk of taking path one isn't some sudden collapse, right? It's not a sci-fi scenario.
No, the text is very specific about this. The real risk is a quiet, irreversible loss of agency.
A quiet, irreversible loss of agency. That is chilling.
It's institutional lag turning into institutional helplessness.
Yeah.
You wake up one day and realize you cannot make a decision about your own infrastructure without permission from an upstream provider. That is the cost of waiting.
So to pull all this together, the technology itself cannot be stopped. The race to catch up via traditional regulation is effectively over because of the speed mismatch. But the environment in which that technology operates is still very much a design choice.
Exactly. We have to move from passive consumption to active orchestration, from the illusion of control to the reality of agency.
It fundamentally changes how you view the news. When a new policy is announced, you have to ask, is this just a speed bump or is this architecture?
That is the question that will define which states preserve their agency in this era.
I want to leave everyone listening with a final reflective question straight from the source material. It's one you really need to mull over. If a state becomes a renter of the intelligence it uses to govern, who is actually designing the future of its citizens?
That is the core of it all.
It really is. Now, for our next part, episode 6 is going to be Leadership in the Age of AI. We will be examining what matters more in a leader when results are fast and cheap, but the effects are increasingly expensive.
I am really looking forward to unpacking that one.
It's going to be a great deep dive. Stay tuned, stay curious, stay systemic.